Caesar, Book 5, Translation 24. With the ships having been beached and the council of the Gauls of Sammarobriva having been completed, because in this year grain in Gaul, because of a drought grain, had grown more narrow, he was compelled differently from earlier years to set up the army in winter quarters and divide the legions into more states, from which legions he gave one to the legate Gaius Fabius to be led into Morini, another he gave to Quintus Cicero the Nervi, a third he gave into the Aesubi to Lucius Roscius, a fourth he ordered to winter in the Remi with Titus Labienus, in the neighborhood of the Treueri. He had set up 3 in Bello. He put the quaestor Marcus Crassus and the legates Lucius Munatius Plancus and Gaius Trebonius in command of these. He sent 1 legion, which he had recently enlisted across the Po River, and 5 cohorts into the Erebrones, of which the greatest part is between the Mosa and Rhine rivers, which were under the command of Ambiorix and Catuvolcus. He ordered the legates Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurelius Cotta to be in command of these soldiers. In this way, with the legions having been divided, he thought that he was able to most easily cure the lack of grain. And however, the winter quarters of all these legions, except that one which he had given to Lucius Roscius in order to be led into the most peaceful and quiet part, which were contained within 100 miles. He meanwhile, until he had learned that the legions were set up and the winter quarters fortified, he decided to delay in Gaul. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 25. There was among the Carnutes Tasgetius, born of very high rank, whose ancestors had held the sovereignty in his state. To this man, Caesar, on account of his virtue and attachment toward him, he had restored the position of his ancestors, because in all his wars he had been useful himself of remarkable services. Already the 3rd year, the enemies, with many authors openly from the state, killed him who was ruling. This matter was reported to Caesar, that one having feared, because it had an impact on many, lest the state, at their instigation, might revolt, he orders Lucius Placanus with a legion to proceed quickly from Belgium to the Carnutes and winter there, and to send him these men, having been arrested, by whose work he had learned that Tasgetius was killed. In the meantime, he was apprised by all the lieutenants and quaestors to whom he had assigned the legions that they had arrived in winter quarters. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 26. After about 15 days, during which they had come into winter quarters, the beginning of a sudden insurrection and revolt arose from Ambiorix and Catuvolcus, who, although at the borders of their kingdom they had met (been present) Sabinus and Cotta, and had carried grain into winter quarters, stirred up by the messages of Indutio Marcius of the Treueri, compelled their people, and having suddenly fought the wood gatherers (outside the fort), they came with a large body to attack the camp. When our men had quickly taken up arms and had ascended the rampart, and with the Spanish cavalry having been sent out on one part, had been superior in battle, the enemy, with this thing having been despaired of, drew off their troops from the assault, that some of our men should go forward to a conference, alleging that they had some things which they desired to say about the common interest, by which things They hoped their disputes could be removed/lessened. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 27. Gaius Hirpinius, a Roman horseman, close friend of Quintus Titurius and a certain Quintus Ionis from Spain, who already had previously planned to come to Ambiorix for Caesar's dispatch. Gaius Hirpinius is sent to them for the purpose of gathering. Among them, Ambiorix spoke in this manner, that he himself confessed that he owed him in return for Caesar's benevolence towards himself, because by his agency he had been freed from a tribute, because he was accustomed to pay to the Adiatuci his neighbors, and because to him, Ambiorix, both his son and his brother's son, had been returned by Caesar, whom the sons, having been sent in the number of hostages, who the Adiatuci had held amongst them in servitude in chains, and he had not done that which he would have done regarding the attack of the camp, either by his judgment or free will, but by the force of the state, and that his government was of this kind, that the people were holding no less authority over himself than he himself was holding over the people. To the state, moreover, the cause of the war was this: because it could not resist the sudden conspiracy, he was able to prove this easily from his own humility, because he is not so ignorant of things that he is confident that the Roman people are able to be conquered by his troops. But it was the general plan of Gaul that this is the day appointed for attacking all the winter camps of Caesar, so that some/any legion could not come to another legion for help. It was not easy to be able to deny Gaul, the people, to the Gauls, the area. The plan seems to be about restoring the shared liberty. Well, since now he has satisfied them for their devotion, now he, Ambiorix, had an account of duty on account of the benefits of Caesar. He begged Titurius for hospitality, so that they may be mindful of his health and the health of his soldiers. A great band of hired Germans had crossed the Rhine. This group of Germans would be present in 2 days. The decision was theirs whether they want before the nearby Gauls sent to lead the soldiers, having been led out from winter quarters, either to Cicero or to Labienus, the one of whom is about 50 miles, the other a little farther. Then he promised that, and confirmed by sworn oath, he would give a safe journey through his territory, which when he does, and he himself both advises for his state, because it would be relieved from the winter corners, and he would return thanks to Caesar for his services. With this speech having been made, Ambiorix left, and it's from winter quarters, not corners. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 28. Hirpinius and Aeneas report back to the legate that which they heard. Those men, disturbed by sudden things, though these things were said by the enemy. However, they thought that they should not be neglected, and especially they were thoroughly moved by this thing, because it was hardly believed that low and ignoble state of Eurobrones had dared to make war against Roman people of their own accord. Therefore, they carried this thing to the council, and the big debate comes forth among them. L. Aurunculeus and several of the military tribunes and the commanders of the highest rank thought that nothing was to be done rashly, and that they should not leave the winter quarters without Caesar's orders. They were instructing also as many as you wish of troops of the Germans could be sustained with winter quarters having been fortified. This thing was proof that they sustained the first attack of the enemy very bravely with many wounds, in addition having been inflicted by means of grain. They were not pressed. Meanwhile, aid would come both from the nearest winter quarters and from Caesar. At last, what was more unreliable or disgraceful than to adopt a plan about the highest matters with an enemy being author? Caesar, Book 5, Translation 29. Against these things, Titurius kept on shouting over and over again that they would act too late. When larger bands of the enemy had gathered, with the Germans having been added, or when something of a calamity in the nearest camps had been received, brief is the opportunity of planning. Caesar was thought to have gone into Italy, and not otherwise would the Carnutes have formed the plan of killing Tesgetius, nor would the Erebrones, if that man had been present, have come to the camp with such great contempt of our guise. He did not see the enemy as his authority, but the thing. The Rhine was near. The death of Aroisti and our previous victories were a great relief for the Germans. Gaul was aflame with so many insults having been accepted, having been brought under the power of the Roman population, with the previous glory of military affairs having been destroyed. Finally, who would persuade himself of this, that without certain cause Ambiorix had stopped to a plan of this sort? His opinion was safe in each direction. If nothing was more difficult, they would arrive with no danger at the nearest legion. If all Gaul agreed with the Germans, their one safety was set in speed. What end, indeed, would the plan of Cotta and those who disagree have, in which, if there was not a present danger, but certainly famine was to be feared in a long siege? Caesar, Book 5, Translation 30. With this debate having been held on both sides, while it was resisted fiercely by Cotta and his senior centurions, Sabinus said, "Prevail, if you wish, in this way." And in a louder voice, so that a large part of the soldiers could overhear, he said, "And I am not the one among you who is most seriously terrified by fear of death. These men will have good sense if that which is more serious will have happened. They will demand back an accounting from you, who, if it should be permitted by you, on the day after tomorrow, having been joined with the nearest winter camps, they may sustain the usual misfortune of war with the rest of the soldiers. They will not die having been repelled or having been moved by the rest, either by the sword or by starvation." Caesar, Book 5, Translation 31. They rise from the council, they seize each man, and they beg that through their disagreement and stubbornness they not lead the situation into the greatest danger. The situation is easy whether they stay or whether they set out, if only they all feel and approve one thing. On the other hand, they perceive no safety in disagreement. The matter is continued in debate until the middle of the night. Finally, Cotta, having been persuaded, yields. the opinion of Sabinus wins. It is announced that they will go at first light. The remaining part of the night is spent with wakefulness, when each soldier looked around at his things, wondering what he could carry with him, and what of the equipment of the winter quarters he would be forced to leave behind. All things are invented, why they could not remain without danger, and why the danger would be increased by the weariness of the soldiers and the lack of sleep. At dawn they set out from the camp in such a way as though they had been persuaded that the advice had been given not by an enemy, but by Ambiorix, a very friendly man, in a very long column, and with very large baggage. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 32. But the enemies, after they perceived the departure of these men from the noise at night and wakefulness, with ambushes having been positioned in 2 parts in the forest, in an opportune and hidden place about 2 miles away, they were waiting for the arrival of the Romans, and when a greater part of the army had descended into the great valley, they suddenly revealed themselves on either part of the valley, and began to press the rear and prohibit the sight from descending, and began to battle our troops in the most disadvantageous location. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 33. Then at last Titurius, who had provided nothing before, was fearful and running about and arranging his cohorts. Yet these things themselves seemed timidly, and so that everything failed him, which very often was accustomed to happen to those who were forced to make a plan in distress itself. But Cotta, who had thought that these things could happen on the journey, and on account of this reason had not been a supporter of the journey, in no regard was he lacking for the common welfare, and for both calling and encouraging the soldiers he was performing the duties of a general, and in the fight he was performing the duties of a soldier. One, on account of the length of the battle line, they were less easily able to attend to everything by themselves, and to see to what had to be done also on the spot. They ordered to announce that they were to leave their baggage and gather into a circle, which plan, although in a calamity of the sort is not to be reprehended, nonetheless it turned out disastrously, for it both lessened the hope for our soldiers and made the enemy more lively for battle, because it seemed that it had been done not without the greatest fear and desperation. Moreover, it happened, which it was necessary to happen, that generally the soldiers moved away from their standards, which each one of them had hurried to find, and take away those things which they held as most dear from the baggage, and all things were filled up with a shout and tears. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 34. But a plan was not lacking for the barbarians, for the leaders ordered them to announce to the whole battle that no one must depart from the location, that the booty was theirs, and that was reserved for them, whatever the Romans had left behind. Therefore they believed all had been put in victory. They were equal for both, virtuous and eager for fighting. Our men, although they were deserted by their leader and by fortune, however, they were placing all hope of safety into courage, and every time each cohort ran forward, a great number of enemies were dying on that side. With the thing having been noticed, Ambiorix commanded that it be proclaimed that they throw their spears at a distance and not to approach too closely, and in whatever part the Romans might make an attack, to flee, for by lightness of armor and by daily exercise nothing is able to harm the Romans, and to follow those returning to their standards. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 35. With which command having been observed most diligently by them, when any cohort had left from the circle and had made an attack, the enemies were retreating most swiftly. Meanwhile, it was necessary that this part be uncovered and javelins be received on their open side. When they began to return again into the spot whence they had left, they were being surrounded both by these men who had yielded and by these men who had stood nearby. However, if they wanted to hold this place, neither was a place remaining for courage, nor were the crowded men able to avoid spears thrown by such a great multitude. However, having been afflicted by so many impediments, with many wounds having been received, they were resisting, and with the great part of the day having been consumed, although it was fought from first light until the 8th hour, they were committing nothing which was unworthy to themselves. Then each thigh of Titus Balwentius, who in the year before had led the first maniple, a strong man of great authority, was pierced by a spear. Quintus Lucanius, of the same order, fighting most strongly, while he was defending his surrounded son, was killed. Lucius Cotta, the lieutenant, encouraging all the cohorts and orders, was wounded in the face by a slingshot. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 36. Having been influenced by these things, Quintus Titurius Sabinus, after he had caught sight of Ambiorix in the distance, encouraging his men, sent his interpreter Ganius Pompeius to him to ask that he spare him and his soldiers. That man, having been addressed, responded, if he wishes to speak with him, it is allowed. He hopes that what pertains to the safety of the soldiers can be obtained from the multitude. He himself would certainly not be harmed in any way, and in this matter he pledges his word. He consults with the wounded Cotta whether it seemed appropriate that they leave the battle and together speak with Ambiorix. He hopes to be able to get what they want from him about their own safety and the soldiers. Cotta says that he will not go to an armed enemy and persists in this. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 37. Quintus Titurius Sabinus orders the military tribunes whom he had around him at the moment, and the centurions of the first ranks to follow him, and, after he had approached nearer to Ambiorix, having been ordered to throw away his weapons, he does the command and orders his men to do the same. Meanwhile, while they are dealing with each other about conditions, and a rather long speech is deliberately being constructed by Ambiorix, having been gradually surrounded, he is killed. And then, indeed, according with the plan, they proclaim victory and raise a howl, and with an attack having been made on our men, they throw ranks into confusion. There, Lucius Aurunculius Cotta, fighting, is killed with the greatest part of the soldiers. The rest retreat to the camp from where they had gone out. Of these, Lucius Petrosidas, the eagle-bearer, when he was being pressed by a large crowd of the enemy, threw the eagle forward inside the stockade. He himself, in front of the camp, fighting very bravely, is killed. Those men with difficulty withstand the attack until night. During the night they all, to a man having given up hope, killed themselves. A few, having escaped from the battle by uncertain roots through the woods, arrive at Titus Labienus, the legate, into his winter quarters, and inform him about the things that were done. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 38. Elated by this victory, Ambiorix immediately sets out with his cavalry into the Adiatuci, who were neighbors to his kingdom. He stops neither for night nor day and orders the infantry to follow behind him. With the matter having been explained, and with the Adiatuci having been stirred up, on the following day he arrives at the Nuri, and encourages them not to lose the opportunity of freeing themselves forever and getting revenge on the Romans for those wrongs which they endured. He explains that 2 legates were killed and that a large part of the army perished. It is no concern for the legion which is to spend the winter with Cicero, having suddenly attacked, to be killed. He declares himself as a helper for this thing. With this speech, he easily persuades the Nervi. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 39. And so, with messages having been sent immediately to the centurions, the Grudi, the Lawaki, the Plamunxi, and the Gaidumni, who are all under their command, they collect as large bands of men. They were able and unexpectedly rush to the winter quarters of Cicero with the messages about the death of Quintus Titurius Sabinus not yet having been brought to him. To this man it also happened, which was necessary, that several soldiers who had gone into the woods for the purpose of gathering wood and building materials were cut off by the sudden arrival of the cavalry. With these men having been surrounded with a large band of men, the Erebrones, Nervi, Adetuci, and the allies and dependents of all these begin to attack the legion. Our men quickly rush to arms and climb the stockade. With difficulty this day is endured, since the enemy placed all its hope in speed, and they were confident that, having obtained this victory, they would be victors forever. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 40. Letters are sent immediately to Caesar from Cicero, with great rewards having been offered if they delivered them. With all the roads having been watched, those men having been sent are intercepted during the night from the timber which they had brought for the sake of fortifications. A full 120 towers are raised with incredible speed. The things which seem to be lacking from the work are completed. The enemy on the following day, with much larger forces having been gathered, attacks the camp, fills the ditch, by the same method by which the day before resistance is offered by our men. This same thing happens on the next days in succession. No part of the night time is left free from work. Not to the sick, not to the wounded, is an opportunity for rest given. Whatever things are needed for the next day's attacks are prepared at night. Many stakes, hardened by burning, a large number of wall spears are fabricated, towers are built, merlons and parapets are woven from wicker. Cicero himself, although he was in very poor health, left not even the night time for himself for rest, so that he was forced in the end by the crowding around and voices of soldiers to spare himself. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 41. Then the commanders-in-chief of the Nervi, who had some approach of speech and reason for friendship with Cicero, say that they wished to talk. With the opportunity having been made, they mentioned the same things to Ambiorix. He had discussed with Quintus Titurius Sabinus that all Gaul was in arms, that the Germans had crossed the Rhine, that the winter quarters of Caesar and the rest were being attacked. They also additionally report about the death of Sabinus. They point out Ambiorix in order to show their good faith. They say that they are mistaken if they hope for any protection from those who in despair of their own situation. However, that they are of this mind toward Cicero and the Roman people, that they reject nothing except the winter camps, and do not wish that this custom become established. It is permitted for them to go away safely from the winter quarters and set out into whatever parts they wish without fear. That it was not the custom of the Roman people to accept terms from an armed enemy. If they would like to abandon themselves from their arms, they should use him as a helper and send ambassadors to Caesar. He hopes that they will obtain what they asked for because of his justice. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 42. Repulsed from this hope, the Nervi surround with a small wall of 9 feet and a ditch of 15 feet. They had learned these things also from us, though the experience of previous years, and were taught by those whom they held secretly as captives from the army. But with there being no supply of tools which was suitable for this use, they seemed to cut the sod with swords, to remove the earth with their hands and their coats. Indeed, from this action the number of men could be learned, for in less than 3 hours they completed a fortification of 15 miles in circumference. On the remaining days they began to prepare and make siege towers about the height of the wall hooks and movable shelters, which the captives had also taught them. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 43. On the 7th day of the attack, with the greatest wind having been begun, they began to hurl with slings of hot balls made from softened white clay and heated javelins into cabins which had been covered with thatch according to Gallic custom. These quickly caught fire, and the winds, because of their strength, spread into every place of the camp with very great shouting. The enemy, as if victory had already been gained and having been assured, began to push the tower and shelter and ascend the rampart through or with ladders. But so great was the courage of the soldiers and their presence of mind, so that although they were being burned by flames from everywhere and were being pressed by the greatest multitude of spears, they were understanding that all their baggage and possessions were burned up. Not only was no one departing for the sake of abandoning the rampart, but almost not even anyone was departing. And then all fought most fiercely and bravely. This day was by far most serious for our men, but however it had this outcome that on the day the largest number of the enemy was wounded and slain, as they had crowded under the rampart itself, and the last men were not giving the first a retreat. The flame, indeed, having been sent between for a little, and at a certain point, with the tower having been pushed forward and making contact with the wall, the centurions of the third cohort retired from this place in which they were standing and drew back all their men. They began to call the enemy by gesture and by words to enter if they should wish, of whom none dared to advance. Then, with stones having been cast from every direction, they were dislodged and their tower was set on fire. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 44. There were in this legion very brave men, centurions who were approaching the first rank, Titus Pullo and Lucius Vorenus. These had perpetual disputes between them which should be preferred, and because of their very great rivalry, every year they competed for the highest places in rivalry. Of these, Pullo, when the fighting was fiercest at the fortification, said, "Why are you hesitating, Vorenus? Or for what position for approval of your courage are you waiting? This day will decide about our disputes." When he had said this, he advanced outside the fortifications, and he broke into the part of the enemy which seemed most crowded. Nor indeed does Vorenus at that point keep himself within the rampart, but having feared everyone's judgment, followed after. Then, with a fairly small space having been left, Pullo sends his javelin into the enemy and pierces one running from the crowd. With this one having been struck and knocked unconscious, they cover him with their shields, throw their spears all together at the enemy, and do not give an opportunity of retreating. Pullo's shield is pierced through, and a short spear is stuck firmly in his sword belt. This misfortune turns aside his scabbard and hinders his right hand from trying to draw his sword, and the enemy surround the hindered. His rival Vorenus runs to help and comes to the aid of that struggling. The entire crowd immediately turns itself away from Pullo towards this one. They think that one has been killed by a javelin. Vorenus carries on the fight with his sword in hand-to-hand combat, and with one having been killed, drives the rest away a little, while he presses on more eagerly. Having been thrown down onto a lower place, he falls down. Pullo brings help to him, having been surrounded again, and both unarmed. With several having been killed, they retreat inside the fortifications with the highest praise. Fortune, in the rivalry and competition, dealt with each of them in such a way that one rival was a source of help and salvation to the other, and it could not be decided which seemed preferable to the other in courage. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 45. By how much the attack was more serious and more violent every day, and especially because, with a large part of the soldiers having been exhausted from wounds, the matter had come down to a small number of defenders. By so much more frequent letters and messengers were sent to Caesar, some of whom were caught and killed with torture in sight of our soldiers. There was inside a Nervian, Gallico by name, born in a distinguished position, who had fled for refuge to Cicero at the beginning of the siege, and had placed on him his good faith. This man persuades a slave by the hope of freedom and with great rewards, so that he may carry a letter to Caesar. That man carries it out, held together by a spear, and having moved without any suspicion as a Gaul among Gauls, arrived at Caesar. From him it is learned about the dangers of Cicero and his legion. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 46. Caesar, with the letters having been received on the 11th hour of the day, immediately sends a messenger into the Bello to Marcus Crassus, the quaestor, whose winter camp was 25 miles from him. He orders the legion to set out in the middle of the night and to come to him quickly. Crassus departs along with the messenger. He sends another to Gaius Fabius the legate, that he should bring his legion into the territory of the Atrebates, where he knew that he had to travel. He writes to Labienus, if he could do so without detriment to the state, that he should come to the territory of the Nervi. He does not think that he should wait for the remaining part of the army, because it was a little too far away. He quickly collects about 400 cavalry from the nearest winter camps. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 47. Having been informed at about the 3rd hour by the advance guard about the arrival of Crassus, he proceeds 20 miles on that day. He puts Crassus in charge of San Marobriva and assigns him a legion, because he was leaving behind the army's baggage there, in that place, the hostages of the states, the official pages, and all the grain that he had brought there for the purpose of enduring the winter. Fabius, as it had been ordered, having delayed hardly at all with his legion, meets on the march. Labienus, with the death of Sabinus and the slaughter of the cohorts having been found out, since all the troops of the Traueri had come against him, having feared lest, if he made a departure from his winter quarters similar to flight, he would not be able to withstand the enemy attack, particularly whom he knew to be elated with the recent victory. He sends a letter back to Caesar with what great danger he would take the legion out of the winter quarters. He describes an action done in the territory of the Erebrones. He informs that all the cavalry and infantry forces of the Traueri had taken position 3 miles away from his own camp. Caesar, Book 5, Translation 48. Caesar, with this plan having been approved, although the expectation of 3 legions was reduced to 2, however, one hope for common safety was placed in quickness. He came by forced marches into the territory of the Nervi. There he learned from the captives which were brought at Cicero's camp, and how much matters were in danger. Then he persuaded with great prizes a certain person from the cavalry of Gaul that he would carry away the letter to Cicero. He sent this, which was written in Greek characters, lest, with the letter having been intercepted, our plan would not be learned by the enemy. If he should be unable to go, he warned that he throw a spear with the letter tied to the strap inside the fortifications of the camp. In the letter, he writes that he, having set out with the legions, will be quickly there. He encourages him to retain his former courage. The Gaul, having feared the danger, throws the spear as he had been commanded. It by chance sticks to a tower and not noticed by our men for 2 days. On the 3rd day, it is seen by a certain soldier. Having been removed, is delivered to Cicero. He reads it, having been read through, out loud in an assembly of the soldiers, and affects them with great joy. Then smoke of fires is seen in the distance, which thing drives away all doubt of the approach of the legions.